We'll call this meeting to order. We'll have a roll call by our secretary.
Representative Banks,
Here.
Representative Davis,
Here.
Representative Eklund,
Here.
Representative Johnson,
Here.
Representative Ottman,
Here.
Representative Provenza,
Here.
Representative Schmidt,
Here.
Representative Strock,
Here.
Chairman Winter.
Here. Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here today to listen to our bills that we got on schedule. I guess, first of all, we just remember that you're supposed to keep your cell phones on mute, and I don't think I have mine on mute. So, and please address the chairman at all times. So we'll start out with Senate file number 64, and we have Senator Crago here to explain the bill. Senator Crago? 63. Oh, 64, I think. 64 or 63? 63. Oh, my mistake, it's 63.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. It's a pleasure to be before you this morning. Barry Crago, Senate District 22. I sort of missed this committee, actually. So, Mr. Chairman, this is a bill, Senate File 63, State Lands Fencing to Engrossed, is actually a version of a bill we worked during the interim in this particular committee. And at the end of the day, we did not pass it out of committee because it got a little too complicated and overbearing. And I actually think when the committee felt, and I did too, that it was treating state lands different than everybody else, which was not what we were trying to do. And a little bit of backstory on it, Mr. Chairman, committee. We brought this issue came before us this interim, and we had a lot of discussions with our agency that handles state lands. And there really isn't a clear directive in statute how to deal with an issue when someone wants to build a border fence between them and state lands. And so that's why we started working it in the committee. Ultimately, like I said, we did not propose a bill out of the committee. We did not sponsor a bill to deal with this. And so I just decided with some of the committee members, we decided to go ahead and try to do it on our own as an individual bill. And that's really what this does, Mr. Chairman. And it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. If you look at the bill at the bottom of page 1, it creates a new section, a new subsection in 1128-106, which 1128-106 is the current fencing statute and talks about how costs are shared between landowners if you want to build a boundary fence. What this bill does is create a separate section for state lands, because there's one little tweak in there, which is if you're the actual lessee of the state lands, you shouldn't be able to charge the state for building a boundary fence between you and state lands for management purposes. So if you're the lessee of the state lands, you cannot use this section, this subsection, to have state lands pay for part of the cost. And so if you turn over on the back side of the page, it talks about who is responsible for the cost. And so obviously the person building the fence, the adjoining landowner is would be responsible for half the cost, which is the same as if it's a private landowner on the other side of the boundary. The only difference is if there is a lessee, and this was language that our good Office of State Lands asked to put in, if the land is leased, if the state land is not vacant, then that lessee would be responsible for the cost of the fencing, which when we talked about this during the interim, that was our intent anyways. We were going to allow state lands to do it by rule. And so there is rulemaking authority in here. But we just decided on the floor over on the other end of the hall to just go ahead and put that language explicitly in here that state lands, if the state lands are leased, it can be passed on to the lessee and it's their responsibility, which makes sense, and I don't have any objection to that. And so that was how it came out of the Senate. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's just addressing a problem that we've heard from quite a few people exists around the state, in particular when we start leasing vacant lands to people who are not the surrounding landowner or one of the surrounding landowners, and this addresses that problem and cleans up the statute. So we have a solution. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. So happy to stand for any questions from the committee. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Any questions? Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, can you, for BLM land, do they, when someone puts fencing on next to BLM land, do they share costs there?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Provenza, that this does not cover that, nor do our statutes, because that's federal land and we're not allowed to create statute governing federal land. Now, I will say federal land's a little bit of a different issue because the leasing mechanism in federal land is much different than state lands. It's, that it is tied to a piece of base property, whereas state lands is not necessarily tied. So typically those are longer lasting agreements between the lessee and the lessor, in this case, the federal government.
Anyone else? Yes, Representative Davis? Or was it Representative Schmidt? I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify, you said that if the state land is not leased and the neighboring landowner wants to construct a fence, he bears the total cost of that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Smith, no. So if the land was vacant, the way this is written, state land's office would be responsible for paying for half the
Half of
fence.
it, okay.
If the land is leased, then the lessee's the person responsible for paying for half the cost, which we're not talking about very many parcels at any one particular time around the state, but it is an issue that's popped up several times in the last few years. And so that's really what we're trying to get at is, let's make sure we have an answer in the statutes so we're not all wondering what happens. Because right now, state lands, and we heard this during testimony this summer, believes that they're not under any responsibility to do anything, and it's the neighbor's responsibility to keep everything off state lands, and that's not how the rest of the state has to work. And so this just cleans that up.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator. How many parcels are we looking at? I mean, this could be an open-ended, just open the checkbook up. Is there an end in sight?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Johnson, so we're only talking about those parcels where, and it's typically going to arise when they're vacant. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, is when we're talking about vacant parcels. I couldn't tell you if we're talking about 5 or 10, but we're not talking about a whole lot more than that, where it's going to be an issue. It's just not going to, there's not that many open cases right now. This is to address future problems as they arise. It's not going to, it won't be an open checkbook. And I don't know the total number of vacant parcels in the state and how many of those are going to fall under this. The director, who's not here today, but I think somebody from the office is, and they may have a better answer for you. But I don't think because of the language regarding the lessee being responsible for the cost, if there is a lessee, the impact to the state is going to be minimal. Really, we're just trying to make sure there's an answer in the book, in the green books, for when this arises on what to do.
Representative Davis.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, was there any, I guess you would address this in rules, but dealing with the other lands that we lease out there, they a lot of times will pay only for 1/2 of the material, not the installation. Was that the discussion?
Senator.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, no, because we wanted this to line up with the rest of the statute, right? So we wanted it to be, essentially what we're saying is, look, state lands, you're just like all the other private landowners in the state of Wyoming. This is really about creating equity and equality between the different types of lands. That's all we're trying to do. And so that's what this section does, except that we're passing, we are allowing state lands to pass that cost by the language in the bill onto the lessee. But otherwise, we're saying, hey, we're all equal out there. State lands is, not everyone else is fence out, correct? State lands should fall under that same dynamic or same rule.
Thank you. Any other questions for Senator Craigle? Seeing none, thank you. And we'll go now to our agencies. Is there any agency here that would like to visit? Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Cody Booth, and I'm the Assistant Director for the Trust Land Management Division of the Office of State Lands and Investments. Really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion with you today on Senate File 63. So currently, within our rules and regulations, grazing and agriculture lessees who desire to have a boundary fence are responsible for paying for construction and maintenance of that fence. Oftentimes, our lessees work with their neighbors and/or they work through incentive programs such as EQIP to cost share on that fence and maintenance, and there's very little conflict. However, there are some certain circumstances throughout the state, we estimate between 5 and 6 currently, where there is conflict between the lessee and the adjoining landowner. And there is no fully developed mechanism for remedy, which I believe is one of the reasons for this bill here today. And so within the bill, it requires OSLI to pay for the fence and maintenance unless there is a lessee. And just to put that into perspective, we own approximately 3.4 million acres of state trust lands, and close to 99% of those lands are currently leased for grazing and agriculture. So that leaves approximately 1 to 2% that remains unleased as vacant land. So as a result, OSLI would be on the hook for the cost for the vacant land, and we don't currently have this money in our operating budget, so there may need to be an appropriation or some other remedy there. But we estimate the average cost of fence to be roughly $5 to $7 a linear foot, which translates to $15,000 to almost $37,000 a mile. And we don't know how often this statute would be used for how many miles. So we estimated in that fiscal note $100,000 to $1 million. And I want to point out that that estimate was made prior to the amendment, which pushed a large portion of that cost onto the surface lessee. So one concern that we do have with the bill is mainly situational, and this could be used to require OSLI to pay for a fence in the middle of a ranch with only one adjoining landowner, just to keep that landowner's livestock off of the state land, which would create a fence out scenario. And they're already required by law not to trespass onto that state parcel. The bill also gives the authority to the Board of Land Commissioners to promulgate rules and regulations, which we will need to do to manage this program should it be passed. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you said the fiscal note was estimated at 100,000 to $1 million before the cost went to the lessee. Do you have any estimate of what it could be, given this now, I think mostly it talks about 1 to 2% of state land that is not leased?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Representative Provenza, I don't have updated figures on that, but I'd be happy to crunch those numbers and get an answer back to you.
Anyone else? Representative Eklund.
Mr. Chairman, so you presented the scenario that we've kind of found these problems to arise, and that is that a person with private land around state land that isn't fenced, their livestock can't go onto the state land or it's trespass. But the state land livestock going to the private land is not trespass. And that's why we're bringing this thing. It evens up what we do in Wyoming. And am I correct in that assumption?
Mr. Chairman, Mr.
go ahead.
Eklund, that is my understanding. And just if I could go further on that, talking about livestock coming onto that state property, the grazing lessee is responsible for protecting its leasehold interest in the state's forage resource from encroaching livestock. And that's what provides the fence out expectation without the state giving up its sovereignty. So just a little bit more context there.
Yes, Representative Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Booth, how do you handle a situation, I mean, if this passes, do you have any idea or any thought in how you'd handle a situation where the terrain makes it difficult or nearly impossible to follow a line?
Mr. Booth.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schmidt, I don't have the answer off the top of my head for that particular situation. As discussed, there's the promulgation of rules and regulations that we have the ability to do, and maybe that's something that we consider during that process. But off the top of my head, I haven't considered that and don't have a fully fleshed out answer for what that would look like.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other agencies out there who'd like to testify? Okay, we'll go to public comment. Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you all feeling a little better this committee meeting. Last time you were pretty sick when I was here. I hadn't planned to talk about this bill, but I just wanted to kind of refresh our memory, and for those who are new on the committee, our interim work. So as you remember, we were having some issues with vacant lands with the Office of State Lands and Investments, and they were looking to charge people trespass fees for their animals coming on to the properties that they had changed the lease on. And we were just trying to make it a level playing field. Everyone else would be responsible for their share of a fence if a landowner, a lawful partition fence is supposed to be split half and half and maintained half and half. So we were just trying to even that playing field, and we didn't quite get there, but I think this bill strikes the right balance. And so I would hope that this committee would see the merit in the bill and pass it. And I'd stand for any questions.
Any questions for Senator Steinmetz? Seeing none, thank
Thank
you very
you.
much. Senator Steinmetz, are you planning to stick around for that bill number 81?
Mr. Chairman, that's why I'm here.
Okay, well, thank you so
Thank
much. Any more public comment? Mr. McGagna, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagnon with Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. We stand solidly behind this bill because we think it's important. The principle that it brings to the table, that it doesn't matter if they're state trust lands or private lands, that's the way we do business with fencing in Wyoming. We do have a number of concerns in terms of how this would be implemented that hopefully can be addressed in the rulemaking process. And just a few examples of that, we would want to be sure that a current lessee is a part of the discussion before there's agreement to build the fence. They don't just suddenly find out they get a bill in the mail and they weren't involved in the discussion with the adjoining landowner and with the state land office. Another issue that comes to mind, we would assume that because this is an improvement on the state land, that if the current lessee loses their lease and the subsequent lessee comes on, that this would be something that they would have to reimburse the current lessee for the cost of, just like any other improvement. But the other interesting thought that occurs to me is if it's vacant land and the state pays to put the fence on and then subsequently leases that land to someone, how will that be dealt with? Will that new lessee become liable for paying the full amount of the 50% cost of that fence immediately upon leasing, or it'll be over time or whatever. So that, because these are very expensive today, building fences, we hear numbers as high as $27,000 a mile, that we want to be careful we're not doing this in a way that places a burden on a state lessee that the lessee was unaware of or is unprepared to deal with. But with that in mind, we still believe that this is the right way, and we'll work with the Office of State Lands to develop regulations that address all of these concerns. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Magagna? Representative Eklund.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Magagna, so the concerns that you have could be addressed in rules is what, are you suggesting that? Because I'm not sure how to amend it into the bill, but I think state lands would have the framework here. And I'm hoping they could set up rules.
Mr. Chairman,
Magagna.
Representative Eklund, I believe that they can be addressed in rulemaking. Now, if we're not successful in addressing all of them with rulemaking, we may be back to this committee next year asking for some additional clarification in the statute. But at this point in time, we're willing to look toward resolving those issues in rulemaking.
Okay, any more questions? See none, thank you for being here.
Good morning, Chairman
Welcome.
Winter, members of the committee, Era Arano, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. As a reminder, we're a general ag organization that represents small family farmers and ranchers, and all of our policies are member-driven. We sit in support of this bill. We appreciate the clarity it provides, and rulemaking can continue to provide that clarity where necessary. And I stand for questions.
Any questions?
Thank you.
See none, thank you. Yes, come forward.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm Kelly Kennedy. I try to stay out of the weeds. A piece of state ground I was leasing, the state took away from us wrongfully, and we tried to get that corrected. But as it stands, they gave it to somebody that has never owned livestock or anything else. Now, they tell me it's my responsibility. Oh, is that it? Okay, sorry. Anyway, I guess I'll back up. I'm Kelly Kennedy, live up at Wheatland. The state, in my opinion, wrongfully took a piece of state ground I was subleasing away and gave it to somebody that's never owned a cow or anything. And we're gonna try to get that corrected, but it's a problem. And Jason Crowder said that I needed to supply all the fence to fence it off. It's gonna fence the 3 pieces of BLM and everything else or in 3 different pieces and 2 without water and one thing another, creating a lot of problem. But at the end of the day, I still don't see why I should supply all the fence for 1.5 miles plus a car gate. You should keep that in mind too, because it crosses a county road. So I think the state should pay part of that car gate. If they created all this problem, the least they can do is pay for half of it. Any questions?
Yes, anybody have questions for Mr. Kennedy? Yes, Representative Strzok.
Thank you, Chairman. My question, I guess, would be, do you feel like this bill would be helpful for you?
Yes, I think it'd be very helpful, but they tell me that it won't help me because it's already past the time or something, because this law has come out after they'd already made their decision, and I don't know if that's true or not.
We've got someone back here shaking head no, so I hope we will be able to help you.
I hope
no.
so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Cody Booth, could you come up here again and address this situation? Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And what specifically would you like me to address with this situation?
Could you answer some of this, Mr. Kennedy's questions about, I guess we need to know where the state is at on this and why we're charging him with all of this extra, these extra fees.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, if I could explain the situation a little bit. 10% of our grazing leases renew each year. And within that time period that they have to renew, they can be conflicted. And this particular lease was conflicted, and it was determined that there were violations of the provisions of that lease, which resulted in not having the preferred right to renew that lease. A director's decision was issued. It was given to the conflicting applicant. And I believe Mr. Kennedy has lands that adjoin that state property of which he had lost that lease to, or the lease was lost to. And so to prevent trespass, I believe it may require fencing in that particular scenario on that boundary. And so that's the situation. If there's a need for fencing in lieu of other strategies to keep livestock from trespassing onto that state property, then there isn't a mechanism for OSLI to pay for those costs. And so that's where we stand with this particular situation.
Okay, thank you. Representative Strzok?
Thank you, Chairman. So clear up something here for me even with this bill. If the new leasee is taking this, should he not be the one paying for half the fence and the state? Why would Mr. Kennedy be responsible for paying for that to keep him off? That's, okay.
Mr. Booth?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Strzok, so within the law, the trespass exists if you go onto the state property. And so that's the rationale for potentially needing that fence to keep unowned livestock of the lessee off of that property.
Thank you. Follow up.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. So I guess what I'm asking and need to hear is Mr. Kennedy will not be responsible for putting this fence up because his state lease was taken away from him, what he's always used, and it's been part of his whole operation. And now, because it's been taken away, are we saying that he is now responsible to keep stuff off? Otherwise, he's going to be liable for trespassing? Or are we saying that the state and the other leasee is going to take that? I guess just need that clarified for all of us here and for Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Strzok, that is correct. He would need to pay for that fence to keep livestock off of the state property. And certainly, when you're considering that state and agricultural lease, that allows a grazing and agricultural lessee to do improvements. One of those includes fencing, and we don't require all state parcels to be fenced. And so if the lessee determined that it was in their benefit to construct that fence on that state property to keep their livestock off of someone else's property, then they would be able to go through that process and build the fence of their own volition. But if the fence is strictly being constructed and needed to keep private livestock off of the state parcel, that's my understanding.
Any more questions? Follow up? Yes, Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure that you're following the intent of the bill. If the new leasee, right, and the adjoining landowner, if they want to prevent that interaction between the livestock there, then the new leasee, since he is the leasee, correct, would be responsible for half of that fence, the cost, even though the gentleman that is no longer leasing it but is adjoining it, the issue exists. So he would pay half and the leasee would
pay half. Is that correct?
Mr. Booth.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, and I apologize if I misunderstood the line of questioning there, but certainly if the bill were to be passed, that would be my understanding. I was merely trying to describe without the bill what it looked like.
Representative Davis?
That brings up my one follow-up question. There's a standard for fence in Wyoming, but we a lot of times have different livestock, such as sheep. So there's woven wire fence and 3-strand barbed wire fence, so how is that, or would that be addressed in your rules? Or is there just a standard that you're only going to pay for, the lesser amount would be the 3-strand barbed wire, even though the woven wire would be the required fence to keep the sheep out? Just a question.
Mr. Booth.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, I believe fencing type and a number of other questions, level of maintenance, all of that needs to be addressed in the promulgation of rules and regulations. And I believe this is one such issue that would need to be addressed through that process.
Okay. I have a question for you. Why is the state leasing state land to people who do not have livestock? Is there a statute that allows that? Evidently there must be, but seems to me that if we're going to be talking livestock and on ag land that's designated ag in the state, that we ought to be trying to deal with livestock people. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. That's a great question. And if you read the qualifications to lease state trust lands for grazing and agriculture leasing, it does include that you have actual necessary use for the land and its forage. And when you make an application to the Office of State Lands and Investments to be approved for a lease by the Board of Land Commissioners, you certainly have to prove that you have actual and necessary use for the land and the forage. So that is a provision, and that's what we do look at when we are reviewing these applications.
Okay. Representative Provenza?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm trying to help clarify. Our state lands have, part of the intent is that they have to help raise money for our schools. And so someone might be leasing the land that doesn't have ag in part because they are going to make the state more money.
Would you like to respond to that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Provenza, certainly there are commercial opportunities that coexist with our grazing and agriculture leases. And there is a provision that also addresses surface impact payment. Say, for example, you've got a well pad and access road, and they need 5 acres for that on a parcel of state trust lands. There would be a surface impact payment made to the grazing lessee for that loss of forage, that nuisance, all of that exists at that particular time. And so that's how it typically works.
Okay, thank you. Anyone have any more questions for Mr. Booth? Thank you very much for being here. Are you going to be able to stick around for that last bill?
I wouldn't miss it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kennedy?
Are you still on this one?
Yeah.
Is it on? There it is. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Trying to keep it very short and sweet. 10 years ago, I bought the ranch from Steve Burnett, the main ranch, and I ran his cattle on this state lease up there and ran his cattle on shares. He has subdivided all that place. He kept 35 acres and everything. And he held all the state leases, which was 2 different pieces, a full section and an 80, and the BLM leases. When it came time to renew, they said we were in violation because we did not have a sublease in place. I did not pay any more than anything else. We did what the state land said we needed to do, filed the paperwork, and was approved and everything else. In the time, I also pointed out to the state land, sent letters and pictures of where the opposing person had taken fence out and was illegally grazing 80 acres of that state ground with his horses, and that's all he has for livestock. He's retired on disability, so he has not had a job in the 10 years I've been around, and one thing another. But the state decided we were in violation 5 months after they approved our sublease and gave us the lease. The director went back and took it away from us and gave it to them. What I wanted to see it is it split, where he had the 80 acres he is already illegally grazing and not paying anybody, and give us the full section, which gave us access to all the BLM and the deeded ground Steve kept. And with selling the subdivision, he retained all grazing rights until they fence him out. And so I'm still trying to get this straightened some way or another, but the guy they gave it to doesn't have a job, likes to fight, and packs a pistol on his hip. And one thing is the state said I needed a trail permit to go across that state ground with them cattle. And 140 acres of that BLM is totally isolated. I couldn't even get to unless I go across it. But they said they won't give me a permit if he didn't sign it, and we took a permit to him and he will not sign it. And so I think there's gonna be all kinds of problems. But I'm still kind of hoping we can resolve it some way or another.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Kennedy?
Sorry.
Seeing none, thank you for being here. Any more public comment? About Zoom?
Mr. Chair, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to join virtually today. Kelly Carpenter, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. I will be brief in the interest of time, but here to support Senate File 63. We like a lot of things about the bill, but we really appreciate how the bringer crafted the language to follow typical Wyoming fence rules, and that each party pays for half of the construction. As well as echo previous speakers' sentiments to ensure that all stakeholders are at the table prior to fence construction. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions that you or the committee may have.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Carpenter? Seeing none, thank you very much for your comments. We'll now go to, is it Nancy McCann? Oh, okay, so we're finished with, okay, thank you very much. Okay. Committee, what's your pleasure with the bill?
I'll move the bill.
Second. It's been moved and seconded, moved by Representative Banks and second by Representative Eklund. Is there any discussion?
Question.
Question has been called for.
We're voting on Senate File 63. No amendments. Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Representative Eklund.
Aye.
Representative Johnson.
No.
Representative Ottman.
Aye.
Representative Provenza.
Aye.
Representative Schmidt.
Aye.
Representative Strzok.
Aye.
Chairman Winter.
Aye.
8 aye, 1 no. This bill would pass.
Thank you. That bill has passed the committee, 8-1. We'll now go to Senate Files 64 or 81. Okay, I'm sorry. Well, I'm really confused today.
I think, is that the one we're gonna do next? I don't remember.
Yeah, we can do it. Yes. Senator Craigo, please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think Senator Steinmetz might help me on this one. We worked pretty hard on the Senate side to get this one through the process. Mr. Chairman, Committee, this is Senate File 81. Again, I'm Barry Craigo, Senate District 22. And Mr. Chairman, Committee, again, this is a committee bill. We worked this through the interim, and we brought this bill in response to a Supreme Court case that said essentially state lands are not exempt from taxation unless they're used for a governmental purpose, which was already in the statute. We actually already knew that. But the Supreme Court just made it clear. And in that case, they actually referenced grazing lands, state leased grazing lands. And so this committee brought an interim bill, sponsored an interim bill to deal with that particular issue. And what this particular bill did as it came out of committee was exempted all state-owned lands and created a 2-year sunset so that we could figure out how to handle this problem, how to deal with the problem. When we took it to the floor, actually, we had a lot of discussion and a lot of pushback on the general exemption of state property. And one of the reasons is if you look in your green books in Title 39-11-105, we talk about the exemptions, but then we also talk about those state lands and state properties that are not exempt. And there really wasn't a clean, concise way to deal with that. And so ultimately, I think the good senator to my right and myself and a few others decided, well, let's just tackle the problem we know we can tackle, which is the grazing lands. And so that's all this bill does. It creates a 2-year tax exemption for grazing lands, and allows us the time to go figure out what we want to do, allows probably our good revenue committees to deal with the problem, have that discussion. There was another bill in the Senate that would have had a much broader exemption, and it did not make it out. And so this is the last remaining option for us to deal with this. I think we keep it simple, just attack the state lands issue. And that's the one that I believe affects our assessors the most, because there's so many of these parcels that they're not currently taxing. They can identify them, they can get them in, but the fiscal note on it's about $3 million if we don't pass the exemption. The state would be paying that because right now there's no way for them to pass that cost on to the lessees. If we don't have an exemption, I think there will be that pass along cost at some point, but what we're trying to do is let's figure this out. Because I think in some cases the taxes will raise their grazing fees or grazing rates by 30 to 40%. And so that's not something a lot of us were tickled to hear. And so this is our attempt to at least buy us some time to solve the problem long-term. I'm sure Senator Steinmetz has probably some comments to go along with that. And then I know we'll both be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Okay, thank you. Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sherry Steinmetz, Senate District 3. I would echo those comments and just reiterate that somehow this cost will be passed along to the grazing lessees. So this is a very important bill for our lessees across the state and for the Office of State Lands. And it was one of those things that came to us at the last committee meeting because of how the court case fell. Those of you who were on the committee probably remember that. And so this is just our attempt to buy some time to figure this out and get it right for the state of Wyoming.
Thank you. Any questions for the two senators? Representative Banks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just kind of out of curiosity here, what was the purpose behind it sunsetting? Is just so we can look at it, or, because I'm like, this not a bad idea to go on for perpetuity, but just general curiosity there.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Banks, that came out of committee. And so we did not change that part of the committee's wishes or desires. That was something we talked about in committee. That's how it came out, that we agreed as a committee, we're not gonna tackle the long-term solution, so we didn't change that. And that's just where that came from. And I think that was partially, we're gonna hear from our good director here in a minute. And I think that was also in conversation with her, also with the Office of State Lands, and also with the other, some other people within the executive branch. Hey, let's buy ourselves some time. Let's have that conversation before we make a long-term solution. I'm also not sure how successful that would be at this point. So this I know we can do. I'm not sure going further than that's an option.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here. Okay, do we have any agencies that'd like to respond to this?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to Senate File 81. As stated, and both senators really did cover the crux of what this legislation is attempting to address. But just a little more background. We had a Supreme Court decision, October 9th, 2024. The parties to that appeal were the state of Wyoming versus Uinta County Assessor. What this particular property was land that the state leases to a truck stop for a commercial parking lot. The improvements, all the structures, anything on that land had been valued by the local county assessor and paid by the property owner, the lessee. But the assessor deemed that the land under those improvements was not being used for a governmental purpose, and so she put it on the assessment rolls. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. A little bit of history, and the Supreme Court covered all of this. It's actually our Constitution that is in question here. In 1955, the legislature passed a joint resolution proposing to amend the Constitution to exempt governmental property from property taxation only when used primarily for a governmental purpose. That went before the voters, and it was passed, and it's been in place ever since then. However, the legislature has not defined what is primarily used for a governmental purpose. And that is what brings us here today. The Supreme Court, within this case, specifically said that the land that was being used for a parking lot for the truck stop was not primarily used for a governmental purpose. And during the litigation, the state of Wyoming referenced, should the court decide that this land was taxable, that it was going to have broad implications because of other lands that are managed by the state of Wyoming. The court stated that whether such an exemption should be created is a policy question for the legislature, not for this court, and found under the plain language in Title 39, 11-105, the exemption that the state argues for simply does not exist. So that brings us to the situation where county assessors across the state, as of that decision, were challenged with how do we value 3.4 million acres of land? And we worked with the Office of State Lands. Fortunately, due to GIS functionality, we were able to take a map, a GIS map of the state of Wyoming, and I know this is just a visual. Everything in blue are state grazing leases. All of the dots across the state of Wyoming, approximately 26,000 active grazing leases. The way agricultural land is valued is based on its capability to produce. We look at the land resource area based on climate. We also look at soils information, and then we determine what's the productivity of that ground. Since these are all grazing leases, we were able to take that information and use the highest value. We basically do an agricultural land study, the Department of Revenue, on an annual basis to determine the low and the maximum value per acre for grazing land. We use that highest number for the fiscal note, and that's where we came up with about $2.8 million approximately that would be the tax if all of this land were deemed agricultural. Now, due to time, you may, if any of you own land that is valued agricultural for property tax purposes, you know that you apply for that exemption because there are 4 criteria. The land must be used to its capability to produce. You have to have received money for the sale of an agricultural product. It cannot be in a platted subdivision. And if it isn't used to its capability to produce, there's got to be a reason why. So once we take all of this information in an application process, that's when, for privately held land, you would see an assessment schedule that's valuing that land per acre based on the agricultural classification. We were going to assume that all of these parcels were being used for agricultural due to the time requirements of assessment schedules for 2025 have to be out no later than the 4th Monday in April. So this concept came before the legislature. We had both the Ag Committee and the Revenue Committee basically back up and say, we need some time to determine what is primarily used for an agricultural purpose. The Revenue Committee had a much broader approach, naming a committee. This bill simply says for 2025 and 2026 tax year, land that is leased for grazing purposes only shall be exempt. And then we would come back then and determine, that's a policy decision that the legislature needs to determine. Is that a governmental purpose or not? But if this bill were not to pass, we will be sending assessment notices to the Office of State Lands. Now, State Lands has indicated that the lease agreements that are in place today for grazing leases do not include language that passes that cost on to the lessee. Now, they have also indicated that for commercial lands, those other types of uses, that there are provisions within those leases. And county assessors across the state will be valuing the land underneath those commercial uses for 2025. This bill only provides an exemption for the grazing leases. And of course, once the interim, hopefully there's an interim topic on defining what is a governmental purpose. And then if it's deemed in the future that other lands should not be taxed, that'll be addressed at that time. But Mr. Chairman, that's where we're at. If this committee, if the legislature deems that all of those lands should be taxed for property tax purposes, the Department of Revenue and your county assessors across the state stand ready to start that process as quickly as possible so that we can get that updated. But if this bill were to pass, we would put the hold on that, and we will not be assessing grazing leases for the 2025 tax year nor the 2026 based on the language in this bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Representative Ottman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just point of information, how long had that truck stop been there? And also, when they applied for their permits, was it through the OSLI? Who was it through? And was that criteria the same then as it is now? I mean, what happened?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ottman, based on the findings, it states since 1999, the property had been leased to Pilot Corporation, and it was not until 2022 that the Uintah County Assessor went ahead and assessed that land for property tax purposes. One of the reasons for that is the presumption with government-owned property, the legal presumption is that it's exempt from property taxation. The assessor has to overcome that presumption, and I can honestly tell you that across the state, county assessors had not been valuing that leased land, whether it be grazing leases, commercial leases, they had not been leasing state land. For 2 interims, the Revenue Committee discussed what is a governmental purpose, and there were bills that were provided to, or drafted and introduced to discuss this at the legislature, and they never went anywhere. And so I think what happened is we had a county assessor that said, we haven't been able to get guidance as to what is a governmental purpose. I'm going to have to ask the court. So she did. And the court said, those are taxable unless the legislature deems them to be a governmental purpose. And so that's where we are today. I hope that's helpful.
Any more questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Ms. Henson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Booth, thanks for being here again.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Cody Booth, Assistant Director, Trust Land Management Division of the Office of State Lands and Investments. I'm going to mirror a lot of the points that were previously made, so I'll try and be brief. On December 11, 2024, the Office of State Lands and Investments presented supplemental budget requests to the Joint Appropriations Committee. OSLI is requesting $3 million to address the estimated tax obligation for 2025. This request is estimated with the assumption that all lands will be assessed as grazing and agriculture, as was described, and further, it's assumed that all these lands qualify for the agriculture tax reduction. These assumptions come from conversations, of course, with the Department of Revenue and then also with the county assessors themselves. It's anticipated that this tax estimation may be appropriate for 2025, but the assessors will be working in 2025 to determine how to assess taxes in the future. This is likely to include commercial uses, which will be assessed at a higher value. If only lands used for grazing and agriculture are exempt, that would still leave commercial land subject to taxes, and it's likely the taxes would exceed what we have estimated in that supplemental budget. The last comment I would make is that the definition of governmental purpose is very unclear. Vacant lands available for lease may or may not fit this definition. The highest concentration of vacant land and highest value lands that we manage lie in Teton County. So we are uncertain how vacant lands are going to be impacted by property taxes. And with that, happy to stand for questions.
Any questions for Mr. Booth? Seeing none, thank you very much. Are there any other agencies like to comment on this bill? Okay, we'll open it up to the public. Mr. McGagnon, I see you're here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Jim McGagnon with the Wyoming Stockholders Association. We feel that this legislation is critical. This came kind of as a surprise to all of us. It needs some time to be sorted out. The legislature is going to have to make the fundamental decision, what is a governmental purpose. State trust lands are managed to derive revenue for our schools and other beneficiaries. Does that classify them as a government purpose? That's a question that you as legislators will have to address. The other reason I think this is important, almost immediately after the Supreme Court issued their ruling, the Office of State Lands came out with a proposed emergency rule and a proposal to initiate a permanent rule to say that all state lands leased for grazing agricultural purposes beginning January 1st, 2025 would have a provision that the lessor is responsible for paying the property taxes. That was going to create a real inequity. If I happen to renew my leases because they fall due every 10 years, in 2024, for the next 9 years, I don't have to pay the property tax. If yours fell in January of 2025 or thereafter, then immediately you have to begin paying the property tax on yours. So clearly, the first thing is going to be determine, is this a governmental purpose? Once that determination is made, if it should be that it is not a governmental purpose, then we're going to have discussions about how this can equitably be applied to the lessors of state trust lands for agricultural purposes. So for that reason, I think this is necessary and a common sense approach to saying, let's not jump into something brand new without giving it the full and careful consideration that it deserves. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would offer our support for this bill as being a necessary piece of legislation, and we'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions for Mr. McGagnon? Representative Eklund.
Mr. Chairman, whoops, I think that's mine. There we go. So in our example, we have the filling station in Uinta County with the parking lot, and it's being assessed and taxed. Where does that tax money go? Because I'm guessing it might not go to benefit our schools.
Mr. McGagnon.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Eklund, I'm not exactly sure what the breakdown is, but primarily it goes to, the tax money goes to local governments. The revenue that is derived from the leases goes clearly to the school, from the school fund and to help our local schools. But the tax dollars, I believe, go to local, primarily to local government.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, I guess, thank you very much for being here. And are there any more public comments? Come right ahead, Ms. Henson.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, so for the land that is owned by the state and that we would be assessing for property tax purposes, those taxes would be distributed just like any other privately held land. So it would be 70% to education, approximately, the 12 mills to county government, Whedon Pass conservation districts, anyone that had the authority to levy a property tax, that is where those tax dollars would be distributed.
Thank you very much. Yes, Representative Bodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Henson, just because you're sitting here, but just to give me some information, with a 2-year time on this for things to be worked out, what is going to be the process? What peoples or groups will be involved in making these policies and decisions? And is there a mechanism already in place to say how that's going to happen that you know of?
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ottman, I believe that it will go through the interim topic process. It will be assigned to a committee and there will be testimony taken. I do believe that there may be some interest in looking at a broader definition of what is a governmental purpose, or it may be limited to just the agricultural leases and simply leave other uses for state-owned lands to be taxable. The discussion may go further because it's not just state lands and state-owned property that need to be defined by what is primarily a governmental purpose, because this is also a definition that should be applicable to county, municipality. We do have some case law out there related to what is primarily a governmental use, but I think the responsible way to approach this is to look at all of the case law that we've got currently on the books, and then make that determination of defining governmental purpose, and then going back to how are all these lands being used. I had done a presentation during the interim twice in the Revenue Committee, and gone through all of the differing situations and on how government-owned property is used. And I think that that is just going to be a good starting point for this. But all this bill does for 2025 is simply limit the exemption to these grazing leases only. All other uses will be assessed and taxed by county assessors for 2025 based on that Supreme Court decision.
Any more questions for Ms. Henson? Seeing none, thank you very much. Any more public comment? Senator Steinmetz, do you have anything else to add? Okay. We have Zoom.
Kelly, if you go ahead.
Okay,
Thanks again, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Kelly Carpenter, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, sitting firmly in support of this bill. We appreciate that it's a temporary targeted measure to protect grazing ag leases until that more definitive direction from the legislature on the governmental purpose question stemming from the Supreme Court decision, is made. With that, I will take any questions.
any questions for Ms. Carpenter? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Is that it? Okay, thank you. I guess we'll close public comment. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Second.
The motion's been made and seconded that we move the bill forward. Representative Strzok made the motion and Representative Dalton Banks seconded. Any questions? Oh, anyone have any discussion on this bill?
Question.
Okay, question's been called for. Would you care to take,
We're voting on, we're voting on Senate File 81 with no amendments. Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Representative Eklund.
Aye.
Representative Johnson.
Aye.
Representative Ottman.
Aye.
Representative Provenza.
No.
Representative Schmidt.
Aye.
Representative Strzok.
Aye.
Chairman Winter.
aye.
Vote is 8 aye, no. And this bill would pass.
Okay, thank you. The bill is passed the committee on a vote of 8-1. I guess we can go to our next bill, which would be Senate File number 63, or 64, I'm sorry. Senator Steinmetz, would you like to present it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sherry Steinmetz from Senate District 3, presenting to you Wyoming opposes mandatory electronic ID devices in livestock. This is the second bill that you've heard about this. I'm sure you've passed the other one over to us. That was the committee bill. In working on this issue, there were 2 resolutions passed by the Livestock Board to oppose this, and then this is the second one they passed that we are putting into law. It states our legislative findings that we have had, our system has served the industry well for decades, and that the majority of livestock affected by this mandatory electronic identification rule originate from wide open spaces and live on clean, disease-free pastures and not in confined areas with thousands of livestock coming from different areas. And Wyoming already has identification methods that are far superior to the mandatory EID rules that, according to the United States Department of Agriculture and the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, are specifically targeted to apply to only 11% of the livestock in the country, which means, it's an ineffective system when you're only tracing 11%. Onto page 4, Romanet II, Wyoming statute 11-18-117 clearly defines the terms by which the Wyoming livestock industry can continue to do business and have the freedom, right, and liberty to use historically reliable, affordable, confidential, and voluntary methods of livestock identification, including brands, back tags, tattoos, and ear tags. And all of you in the livestock industry know that if we really, where the rubber hits the road is the tattoo in the ear. If a tag is lost or something happens, that is really the identification that everybody relies on at the end of the day. This also contemplates working with agreements to state agreements like we talked about in the other bill. It asks that the United States Department of Agriculture provide a complete and full accounting with accurate information of all costs associated with mandating Wyoming's livestock producers use EID tags, including costs associated with hardware, software, ear tags, wands, retrofitting of livestock handling facilities, sale barns, and the working of livestock and additional costs related. So there's only $15 million that was appropriated to the USDA for this program. That's just to stand up the program within the agency. It doesn't even address all the other associated costs. So it's, probably in the billions of dollars of what this is going to cost. And it's very disproportionate with regards to Wyoming because we are mostly an export state. We don't have the large packing facilities within our state that can export our beef in boxes or in a manner that is not on the hoof. And so we would bear a lot of the costs of this system that other states would not. So basically, we're saying that in subsection C on page 5, the livestock board shall inform livestock producers of the available options under 11-18-117 regarding disease traceability. One of the amendments we made in the Senate was we had the state veterinarian there, but we took that out because we did not want to put them in the crosshairs between the federal government and some of their licensure requirements with health certificates across state lines. And then in subsection D on the bottom of page 5, we're saying that the receiving state, if they have a mandatory EID rule, that then those livestock could be tagged when they're received in that state. And then the next amendment we made is on page 6. We're just in subsection E. We're just saying that nothing in this section shall prohibit a Wyoming licensed and accredited veterinarian from writing a certificate of veterinary inspection in compliance with applicable destination requirements. We want to make sure that they still have the ability to do that and we don't affect that in any way. So, Mr. Chairman, I've taken you through the bill fairly quickly just because I know you're familiar with the subject. We dealt with it during the interim and you had another bill on it. And so I'd stand for any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Senator Steinmetz? Representative Engel.
Senator, Mr. Chairman, Senator. So I guess a question I've got would be on page 4. You referenced lines 7 through 12 and the confidential methods of livestock identification. Had the discussion of interstate health certificates come up as part of the way of identifying livestock and maybe slowing disease that might spread around? We have brand law that ends 400 miles east of here, so our brands will work here, but I don't know how well they work once you get past brand law. I don't know how that works, but just curious about interstate health certificates. Has that discussion happened?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Eklund, that is what the rest of the bill is concerned. The veterinarians will still take care of that. and they will comply with the federal regulations as to what they're required to do for those certificates.
Any more questions? Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, on page 5, I'm looking at the very top of the line. It says Wyoming shall demand that the United States Department of Agriculture. Who are we ordering specifically to do that? Who's in charge of doing that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Provenza, I believe our livestock board would have to ask the questions that we're asking them to ask. They're the ones that deal with this agency. And so we need to make sure that we're asking those questions and demanding what the cost is associated with disease traceability. They are the board that is in charge of that here in the state of Wyoming, so that would be their duty.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Senator
Thank you,
Steinmetz.
Mr. Chairman.
Please come forward.
Mr. Chairman, Committee, Steve True with Director at the Wyoming Livestock Board with Dr. Hallie Hazel, your state veterinarian. Just a couple things I want to mention real quick. Number one, this is a similar bill to one that your committee already passed over to the other house. Both these bills mirror resolutions the Livestock Board has already directed us down this path. We've been working this way since early November. Just a point. As I understand the legislation will go. I would comment on this bill with the amendments that came out of the Senate. Does not interdict the way we're going to do things with the resolutions already with our board. So we don't have much issue with the bill. Dr. Hazel, I think I'm going to ask to address Senator Eklund's question, or Representative, now you've got me doing it. Representative Eklund's question a minute ago about health certificates. I do just want to caution the committee, maybe caution's not the right word, but point out to the committee that Section D, telling buyers in receiving states what they're going to do, I'm not sure what the role of that is, and I would hate to inhibit any potential buyers trying to buy Wyoming cattle by that. A lot of the big states that get mentioned in the business, we're 24th in the number of cattle we have, the state of Wyoming in the nation. So we're kind of in the middle of the boat there, and I sure hate to have Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa buyers say, I don't think I'll come to Wyoming. So I'm a little interested in your commentary on that. I understand the intent of it in the bill, but I'm not sure that that's something that might not intercede in some potential marketing opportunities. Sometimes our marketing is a little inhibited anyway due to our brucellosis status. You'll find the 3 GYA states run into some hiccups, occasionally marketing already. I'd hate to put another little dot on them, but that would be up to the committee and the legislature as a whole to determine if that's an issue or not. I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm reading through this and it says, the buyers in the receiving state shall be responsible for tagging if their state's laws require that. So I would think that that's just kind of a no-brainer there. If their state requires EIDs, then they would need to put those in before they're allowed to go back to the state. Am I missing something there, Director? Or?
Director True, or Dr. Hazel.
Chairman Winter, Representative Banks. So just to elaborate a little bit on Section D and also the question regarding interstate certificates of veterinary inspection. If the receiving state requires an EID tag, the veterinarian has to follow those rules. The veterinarian will be required to make sure that those cattle have EID tags before they leave our state. That is the veterinarian's responsibility, or they cannot write a CVI. So those cattle must be appropriately tagged and appropriately identified to meet all interstate movement requirements before they can leave our state. So as a matter to discuss your question, The veterinarian will have to make sure that those cattle have EID tags. It won't be the buyer's responsibility because the veterinarian can't write a CBI if they don't have appropriate identification.
Director True, do you have anything else to bring about?
Mr. Chairman, not on that point. I think that kind of answers one of our concerns there. So that also might change the way some of our livestock markets work with out-of-state buyers and what they tag, what they don't. And I'm not going to speak for them at all. So that's just something I would bring up. And then I would again defer Dr. Hazel on the ICVI, or that's our term for the certificate of veterinary inspection, if she wants to elaborate to Chairman, Representative Eklund's question a little.
Dr. Hazel, would you care to?
Chairman Winter, Representative Eklund, regarding CBIs, so keeping in mind that EID tags, as far as the animal disease traceability rule is concerned, only apply to certain classes of cattle. So feeder cattle under 18 months of age are not required to have an EID tag. So that exempts them from the movement rule. Other animals that are considered breeding animals, rodeo stock, exhibition, over 18 months of age, all have to have EID tags, unless they can be grandfathered in with a metal tag that was placed prior to November 5th. If those cattle don't have appropriate official ID, when that veterinarian goes to write a CBI, veterinarian is required to put in an official EID tag to write that CBI. So that is where I believe on page 6, we talk about nothing in this act shall prohibit the veterinarian from appropriately writing a CBI, because they will have to apply EID tags, period, regardless of what our rule says in front of us, in order to meet their required accreditation rules, their licensure rules, and the rules for interstate movement and the rules for the state of destination. So they will do as they need to do to make those cattle compliant to get to the destination state. Any questions on that?
Representative Davis.
Mr. Chairman, it seems the intent of this legislation here is that buyer beware. If you buy these cattle that qualify where they have to have the tag in them, it would be up to the buyer, if he's moving them cattle out of the state of Wyoming, to get with you to make sure that he covers the cost of that ID tag and additional paperwork before it leaves the state. That's the way I am interpreting this bill. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis. So I hate to go into the weeds on this little section here, but oftentimes, and you've traded cattle, you know that everything's negotiable. Who pays for what? Who pays for trucks? Who pays for scales? What the shrink is, what the slide is, all of those different things are all negotiable parts of a cattle. This could be part of a trade too. My concern, or what I was pointing out to you, is in statute, and it offers something to a out-of-state buyer. I just don't want to inhibit the chance of any buyer from saying, I don't need Wyoming's cattle, I'll buy them in South Dakota. That's my concern, that's all. So, it's going to be determined in many cases, and then so if that animal requires that tag to go into that state, then they will determine who pays that vet for installing that tag. That can happen there. So I get your point, but my point's a little wider, and I just don't want to spook off any out-of-state buyer because Wyoming statute says that a receiving state. That's all.
Any more questions? I have a question for Director True, I guess. Director, in your estimation, what is the situation with our new administration relative to this EID tag? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, that's out of my wheelhouse. I don't know what's on their list when, and I don't know if this is on their list. I can't speak to that.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate you being here. Any other agencies? Please come forward. Okay. I guess we can go to public comment.
Hello again, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee,
Welcome.
Era Arano, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. Our policies come from our members across the state, and we oppose any premise regulation or electronic identification program that is mandatory, and any that establishes another level of regulation or expense. Therefore, we support the bill. That said, we do want to support our veterinarians and hope that adjustments can be made to allow them to feel comfortable and supported in executing the legislation and their duties. Thank you. I stand for questions.
Any questions? Okay. Representative Ottman.
Mr. Chairman, hi. So in that support, do your members have an idea of how the veterinarian might handle that? Would that be through policy, through more legislation, through what?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ottman, thank you for asking. When we had our state convention in November, this bill had yet to come formally, and so we didn't have specific suggestions in that regard, but I would be happy to reach out to members and see if they have any suggestions. It may take a little bit via email because they're quite busy to get back to you, but if you'd like, I'm happy to ask.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions for the lady? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Any more public comment? Okay, we have Zoom.
Kelly, if you would go ahead.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Again, Kelly Carpenter, thanks for the third time to be able to join you virtually this morning. Just wanted to comment in support of this bill on behalf of our membership. Since 2010, the Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation has been opposed to mandatory livestock identification beyond pre-2024 requirements. Just wanted to quickly emphasize and echo the point of the bringer regarding Wyoming being an export state. That's an important distinction that should be taken into account when considering this bill and makes the case for support even more robust. That said, we appreciate the amendments made that seem to support our veterinarians and hope the amendments could help them do their job within the parameters of their licensure. And we also support the efforts being pursued by the Livestock Board in this vein as well. So with that, we'll take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Carpenter? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here. Guess we have no more remote testimony, so.
Sorry. Yeah, you do. Nancy McCann.
Yeah. Senator Steinmetz, would you like to come back up and take any
Chairman.
questions we might have?
Chairman, we did have one more. Nancy McCann.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ms. McCann.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee. My name is Ann, and I represent the Powder River Basin Resource Council. We have over 100 members within our group. I'm here today on behalf of our ranchers, our producers, and other members to support Senate File 64. We believe it's a critical piece of legislation. We think it's very well written and agree with the amendments that have been made. And so I stand on behalf of our membership in support of this legislation. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions for the Powder River Resource Council? Seeing none, thank you, ma'am, for being here. Give our best to your members. Senator Steinmetz, would you care to?
Thank you, committee and Mr. Chairman. I do believe we've taken care of the issues with the veterinarians with our amendments. I like how Representative Davis put it, that it's a buyer beware provision. That is kind of the intent of it. The law is not just for our agencies, but it's for the citizens of the state of Wyoming. And so with that, I would just stand for any more questions that you have. I think we've brought the bill to you in good shape. And so if you have more questions or want help working the bill, I'd be glad to be on call.
Okay, thank you. Representative Eklund.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, so a scenario I would present, and then I'd ask for your opinion on it, but this happens frequently in the sale barn. Cattle that can stay in the state or can't stay in the state happens if the ID tags are not installed in these, the sale barn would probably make that notification that the buyer can't cross state lines without it. I think it could be hard on Wyoming producers trying to sell stock cows or anything over 18 months of age. Any intact breeding cattle has the amendments you're talking about. We would have to look at a different bill to try to decipher those. The original bill, the amendments were made in the Senate, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead.
Representative Eklund. Yes, in the engrossed copy, you get a blue copy and all the amendments are tracked in. If you want to go back and look at the amendments we made, they're there, or you can also ask for your secretary to have those amendments in the original bill and the engrossed copy, if that's what you want when you look at your bills. The places where the amendments were made were just, on page 5, subsection C, it used to say the state veterinarian and the veterinarian shall inform producers of their rights. We made it the livestock board. And then on page 6, where we added about section E, nothing in this section shall prohibit Wyoming licensed and accredited veterinarian from writing a certificate of veterinary inspection in compliance with applicable destination requirements. And that's when they go across state lines. So whatever requirements are there. I would like to take a moment to address what is happening in Washington, D.C. with regards to this. I can tell you I've worked closely with our Representative Hageman on this issue, and it is one of her top priorities to get this rectified at the USDA. And so they are working diligently on this as we speak, and she obviously has the ear of the administration on this issue.
Thank you. Anyone else have questions for Senator Steinmetz? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I guess that kind of answered one of my questions, what she just said, so. Committee, what's your pleasure for this bill? You have a second?
Second.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded that we move this bill forward.
Senator Strzok. I think she moved it.
Okay. Senator Strzok moved the bill and Representative Johnson seconded. So, yes, Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to explain my vote to the committee. I'm looking at this bill and it reads a lot like a resolution. It talks about the views of how we view things, and it's not necessarily telling folks to do much. There are sections of the bill where it is, but Wyoming will seek to work with existing metal identification tag manufacturers. That doesn't actually tell anybody to do anything. Wyoming already has livestock identification methods that are far superior to the mandatory electronic identification rules. I don't disagree with that statement. But most of this bill is a statement. It's not saying to do anything. And there's a reason why this bill, in comparison to House Bill 92, which we passed, is 6 pages long, and that bill, I believe, is 1 page. That bill, I think, tackles the issue, and we had fierce debate on the floor. It passed. I think it actually says to do things. It says to create the MOUs. It directs the livestock board to do the job that they need to do to protect our identification system. If we're gonna pass 2 bills, it gets a little hairy. And I think I want to bet on the horse we already rode. So I'm gonna be a no on this bill for that reason. I just wanted to explain my position to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Representative Davis.
Mr. Chairman, I think the good representative at the other end of the bar here has made a good point. But the whole point for page 5D is to complement our bill going forward. If we have the MOUs with the other existing states, then this little bit in here about the receiving states, really, that's the way it is, that we won't have to put these tags in. Because if we have an MOU with a receiving state that honors the way Wyoming does business, I think that's what this bill does, is complement the other bill. So I think it's a good bill going forward.
Yes, Representative Provenza?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, Representative Davis, I can appreciate that, but we can't tell other states what to do. Just like other states can't tell us what to do. So in telling other states what they shall do, we're doing nothing, because I can't make another state do this. So that's the other concern. We're going to say, this is what you have to do. Well, other states might say, well, Wyoming's throwing a temper tantrum, but we can't make them get a tag. And so we're muddying our green books with 6 pages of text that does nothing.
Thank you. Representative Strauch.
Thank you, Chairman. So I guess I would just ask Senator Steinmetz if she could clarify some of these issues for us, please.
Thank you. Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you go to page 4, the top of page 4, subsection B, it is the policy of the state of Wyoming. We are creating policy that we oppose this. This has been coming at us year after year after year after year. And we are creating policy that is our policy that we oppose this. So that does something.
Okay, thank you. Would the state livestock board care to comment? Okay.
I call for the question.
Question been called for.
We're voting on Senate File 64 with no amendments. Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Representative Eklund.
Aye.
Representative Johnson.
Aye.
Representative Ottman.
Aye.
Representative Provenza.
No.
Representative Schmid.
Aye.
Representative Strzok.
Aye.
Chairman Winter.
Aye.
The vote is 8 aye, 0 no. This bill would pass. Pardon? I'm sorry.
There was a no.
There was a no.
1 no.
Thank you. I guess we can, that bill passed the committee, so I guess